turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens.
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing
And I was born here in Lincoln and lived in Nebraska until I was 21 years old. I've lived in Lincoln and in Columbus, and when I was a little girl for a few months in Aurora, Nebraska. Well, I was very fortunate to live in a neighborhood and at a time when on a summer evening the elderly people would sit on their porches and talk about when they were children. And I loved to hear their stories, and as long as I was quiet and kept out of sight, they'd talk and I could be quiet and listen. And that was the main influence in my life about how I write, and the stories that I tell are many of them stories that I heard as a child. Not the complete story, but the idea of the story. And I was also very lucky to be able to go to a lot of the historic sites and see things that some of them I really didn't appreciate at the time. Like when my aunt took me to see a sod house that was built in the side of a hill. I was about 11 years old and I wasn't too enthused at all. And now it's one of the most treasured things I have because I actually was in a real sod house that was still standing. There was always the burning urge to make up stories and to tell stories. And when it finally got to the place where I couldn't stand it anymore, why, I was lucky enough to find a writing class and where I wasn't pushed, and I began taking college classes and university classes. And at that time, I had already moved to California, and so I went all over Southern California seeking out the best teachers, and that was where I got my education that way. But it was through the School of Journalism here at the University of Nebraska that I got my first steps, and the who, what, when, why, and how are still the way I start every story. I think Nebraska authors are good storytellers. They tell interesting stories. They tell stories about things that most people can touch and that have touched their lives. They tell stories about people that are real. And they have heard their grandparents and their parents and so on and so forth talking about these things. My agent, Florence Filer, is the agent for the Best Streeter Aldrich estate, and she says that the main thing that she notices is that she noticed in me. She said, "Barbara, you're a good storyteller. You must have come from the Midwest." And I said, "Yes, I came from Nebraska." And she said, "Oh, well, that must be it." Don't give up. On my first novel, I had over 100 rejections before it literally became a classic. It was published by Harlequin, and one of the editors really fought to have it published because it's a very unusual novel. And the other thing that I would say to them now is to watch the electronic publishing. I don't think I know I'm too old to be able to really feel that I'm reading a book unless I have the book in my hands. But I know that my grandchildren are reading books off of their TV monitors, and they're depending on them greatly, and I really feel that there's going to be a big opening in a lot of different ways, that people are going to be able to publish their work both on paper and electronically, and I think it's going to come. I don't think it can be stopped. It's just like the old 45 records. I remember when they came out with them and they said, oh, we're getting rid of the big 78 records, and oh, they can't do that. Well, they did, and they've even gotten rid of the 45s, so can't never did anything. And I'm looking at some possibilities of writing something about the early days of Alaska that might not have been touched on before. And I will continue to write about coming across Nebraska and the Midwest and settling here, even if I use it just as the trail to go somewhere else, because it was the whole trail. It was the whole path to every place. When I write, I try to write to the time period that and use the voice of the people of that time. If I'm writing a post-Civil War novel, I try to write with the dialect and the terms and the anecdotes that the people used, their slang that they used at that time. When I write a medieval novel, I try to be much more straight-laced with the language. I try not even to use any kind of can't or won't. I use cannot and will not, and I try to form the sentences so they're much more formal. In fact, when I'm writing a medieval novel, my grandchildren say, I talk funny. And I'm sure I do, because I'm totally into thinking in a different style. Follows a family from New Orleans to Fort Kearny, Nebraska, and beyond. But the thing that sparked this book, the idea, was the stories that I heard as a child of people who had come to Nebraska in the covered wagons and passed through and were talking about and telling about the sod houses, the log houses, the wind in the fields and the grassland and on the prairies, and also the way the people felt when they first realized what they were faced with, having come from cities and towns. And so, of course, I picked New Orleans because that was just about the fanciest town I could think of to show a comparison. And this part of the story, Melly Sue and Beth Ann, the sisters, find out that they're going to be moving. Melly Sue has inadvertently committed a social indiscretion. I love that word. And their father has had to leave Louisiana and the South, and he has come to Fort Kearny. And he sent a young man named James Thomas to bring his family to Fort Kearny to meet him. And James Thomas has come to the house and informed the mother, and the girls realize that they're going to be going somewhere. But Mama, Beth Ann said as she touched her mother's sleeve in an effort to get her attention, "Where is it we're going? St. Louis? Will Papa meet us in St. Louis?" Susanna's eyes met those of James Thomas. He nodded his head acquiescently. "Your father isn't in St. Louis. We are to meet him at our new home near Fort Kearny." "Fort Kearny," Melly Sue gasped. "You can't mean to make me live at a fort out in the middle of the prairie. If your father sets foot in Louisiana, he'll be hanged for murder. Even the Cadwalder connections are not great enough to save him here in the South. Our only hope is to bring a new life where the laws are less vengeful and the people more forgiving. I won't go. Melly Sue jumped to her feet, upsetting her tea. I'll stay here. Some of my friends will take me in. Ellen's parents would have me if you'd just ask. Are you referring to the same Ellen who hasn't spoken to you since the day you took your ill-fated carriage ride? Her mother asked. Are you talking about the girl whose parents won't receive me, even though they swore to be our best and most loyal friends? Beth Ann sipped her tea. Looking at James Thomas, she realized he knew the full situation. In the dark depths of his eyes, she caught a twinkle of amusement at her sister's tantrum. There are some fine folks in Fort Kearney, he assured them, many Southern people like yourselves who left at the end of the war. Melly Sue sniffed and tossed her head. I'm sure you'll find girls your own age, both of you. What do you think the people do there for entertainment? Melly Sue ventured, not really caring, for she surely wouldn't participate. They have dances and soirees, much the same as you have here, he told them. They go on picnics in the summer and have quilting bees, and Melly Sue's eyes rolled back in her head as though she could stand to hear no more. It sounds uncouth, boring, uncivilized. I won't go. I can't live that kind of life. She sobbed out the words. Think of the dances, Melly Sue, her mother said consolingly. Beth Ann realized for the first time that Melly Sue was echoing their mother's own doubts. Think of the picnics and the soirees, Susanna continued. Think of all the young men at the fort, Beth Ann interspersed, moving aside a split second before Melly Sue's saucer sped past her ear. And when they finally reach the first stop on their destination, they get a look at the first houses that they see that are out in the prairie. The first of the settlers left the wagon train several days later. It was late in the afternoon when the wagons drew to a halt to bid farewell to one of their own. The land was flat and covered with prairie grass that rolled like waves in the constant breeze. Far in the distance, a small structure could be seen. Oh, Herman, the woman said, and threw her arms around the neck of her husband in an unwonted display of affection. A log cabin just as you promised. Isn't it beautiful? Melly Sue sniffed from her vantage point on the seat of the wagon next to Rachel Bright. I thought it was an outhouse, she said dryly. How could anyone be thrilled at having to live in something like that? The look on Susanna's face left no doubt that she reflected her daughter's feelings, though she had enough manners to hold her tongue. It's a good, solid house. James Thomas sat easily on his horse, riding slowly beside them. Far more impressive than the soddies some of them will be living in. What's a soddy? Beth Ann asked. A house made out of mud, James Thomas laughed. Most of the time they cut them into the side of a hill, if there's one available. Then they only have to make one wall out of sod bricks. It stays cool in the summer and relatively warm in the winter. It works fine until they're able to build something proper. Like a log cabin, Melly Sue's voice oozed distaste. Well, I certainly couldn't live like that. Why, our livestock had better quarters in New Orleans. We didn't have any livestock other than a few chickens and horses, Beth Ann reminded her. Nevertheless, we wouldn't have expected them to live in a cave in the side of a hill. Several people moved away, their heads bowed, to return to their wagons. The girls' scorn had cut them to the quick, for they knew they would be lucky to build soddies before winter set in. Like Melly Sue, they had left homes far superior to what they would live in now. It was difficult to raise the gumption to refute the girls' words, no matter how unkind they might be, when in their hearts they felt them to be true. I read a lot of what I've taken there from the journals of the pioneer women, and I heard a lot of it as a child when I sat on the porch and listened to the ladies and the men talk, and sat very quietly so I could hear them talk, because if they noticed I was there, they'd send me to bed. And I'm glad I did. The next book is another medieval story, and in this one, I wanted to have an older heroine. In the medieval times, a person was considered old if they were in their 30s. A 50-year-old person was way over the hill. Only the very rich or the very lucky lived that long. The men died in battle, the women died in childbirth. It was that easy. But when I mentioned that I wanted to write an older heroine, I was told that that wouldn't work. So I wrote a young heroine and a young hero, and then I wrote about old Ethel. And old Ethel just very happily came right in and took over. In the beginning of To Love of Rory, the Celts raid an English village, and they steal the children, which is the way they replenished their supply of population. And the lady of the village that has had the children stolen decides to go after them because her husband is on a crusade. So she's going after them. Who is with me? Serene held out her arms, calling for support. Who is with me, or do I go alone? No one moved. They stood like statues, hardly daring to breathe. Then there was a shuffling in the crowd. An old woman emerged, an English longbow over her shoulder, a quiver of arrows on her back, and a patch over one eye. I stand with you, my lady. I can shoot as well as any man, and will follow wherever you go, as long as you don't go too fast. But how can you hope to hit your mark? Serene asked. You have but one eye. Had two when I was born, the old woman told her, but I lost one to an errant arrow. Decided then and there I would never be satisfied until I learned to conquer the thing that had maimed me. You'll find me as good a shot as any man. Only one eye is needed to send an arrow to its mark. Serene gave a sigh of relief. She saw the old woman's determination and knew her admission to her prowess with the bow gave Serene the solution she needed. Thank you, old Ethel. Serene held out her hand, and the one-eyed woman came to stand behind her. And who else? The fact that old Ethel openly carried her bow and just as openly declared that she knew how to use it gave courage to the other. Several women stepped forward. So having established the fact that old Ethel wasn't afraid to say that she could use the bow, which really was against the law in that time, because if you could use a bow and arrow, you could shoot the Lord's meat supply. And they didn't like that. So it was a big step to do something like that. But old Ethel was used to taking big steps. The Celts escaped with the children. But through Ethel's skill, the Celt chieftain, Rory, was captured. And the head of the Celts sends the seer Drojan. Also, a seer is always an old person. Almost always. Anyway, they send Drojan to learn Rory's fate and bring him home. Well, Serene isn't about to let her prisoner go when she thinks she's got a chance to find out where the kids are. So she goes with him. And she and old Ethel accompanied them to Ireland, which is where they were from originally. And an unlikely attraction begins between old Ethel and the Celt seer, Drojan. When they're on the boat on their way over, and old Ethel is very obviously ignoring Drojan. Since she was disinclined to speak, he studied her beneath the harsh morning light. The hood had fallen back from her head, allowing him to view her face without obstruction. It was strange that she was called Old Ethel, he thought, for the skin on her face was smooth and unwrinkled except for little laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. Even behind the patch she wore, the lines crept forth and turned up like tiny smiles, as if the eye could no longer see, it could still laugh at the world. Her hands were smooth, too, and strong. He did not doubt that she could fire her arrow with the best of men, for she was not a small woman, and most like as strong and fit as many an archer. She turned to him quickly, aware that he was staring at her. Have I turned green, she asked, or are you hoping I will? Neither, he admitted. You're a fine sailor, and that in itself is a relief. This is not the first time I've made such a journey. She reached into the bag at her feet and drew forth a loaf of crusty bread, broke it, and offered him a generous chunk. You were not born at Sheffield, then? Ask your runes, old man. Perhaps they will tell you where I was born, for you'll never learn it from me. She turned her back to him, and her hair caught in the wind and blew against his shoulder. Without thought, he brushed it aside and felt the snap like lightning on a summer night zing through his body. He glared at her as though she had done it purposely, but she held her pose, looking out over the water. The good side of her profile was toward him, and he took in the strong high cheekbones, the square chin, the patrician nose. With her hair streaming out behind her, glinting like precious metals of silver and gold in the sun, she looked for all and good and all like a Valkyrian figure on the bow of a ship. Drojan's heart quaked within his breast as he wondered at the god who would flaw such beauty by striking out her eye. If this was indeed so, what great and portentous event did it foreshadow? He was an elder of his village, a man respected for his ability as a seer throughout the many lands he had traveled. The last thing he needed in his life was a woman, especially an argumentative one who never agreed with his premises and challenged his ability as a spaeman. He settled back into his seat and slowly chewed his bread, unable to believe that he was fascinated by a woman the rest of the world saw as a one-eyed crone. It falls to old Ethel, as an archer, to establish the guilt or innocence of a man accused of spying on the Celt village, because they suspect her of knowing who the man is. They ask her to perform a ritual, either finding the man guilty or finding him innocent, which she agrees to do. But the man recognizes her and passes out cold. So Drojan secretly takes the man's place. Swathed in the cumbersome cloak, the man took his place before the target. He stood completely still, pausing only to flex his legs once so they would not be stiff beneath the covering material. He did not know fear, for his faith in Ethel was paramount. That which he did for her. None would dare fault her, nor bring down her reputation as a bowwoman. He did not flinch as he saw the movement from afar that meant she was knocking her arrow. In a few seconds, he felt the tug at the crest of his hood that told him the arrow had landed true. Next, a streak of fire touched his cheek, and he heard a gasp from the crowd. He had been marked, but still he did not move. The next arrows pinned the arms of his shirt, but did not touch his shrinking flesh, and the last framed his legs. There was a cheer from the people as they pushed to crowd around Ethel. Rory pushed his way through them to the now vindicated man and pulled the arrows from their position. "You are free to go. You've been judged innocent." The man said nothing, and without removing the cloak, disappeared into the shadows. Ethel, too, made herself scarce. She graciously accepted the congratulations that were her due, listening for the voice of the man whose words would have made success complete, but they did not come. It seemed that after he had revived his patient and sent him to be propped up against the target, Drojan had stayed in his rooms, no doubt consulting the runes as to the outcome of Ethel's marksmanship. She threw open the door and entered his abode. "Drojan, where are you? I succeeded without your help, without your bloody runes." "I was there," he assured her. The flame quivered and caught at the far end of the log. A second flame arose. "You lie, seer. I scanned the crowd and saw you not. I was with you in every move you made." "Why do you tell such falsehoods?" she demanded. "Think you I cannot believe what I see?" "Then believe," he said, as the two flames reached out and touched tentatively before grasping one another and bursting into brightness that slashed through the shadows. She took his face in her hands and saw the love and admiration in his eyes and the wound on his cheek. His lips touched hers. The flame kindled. "I could have killed you, seer. How did you know I would not? Because you are so great a seer?" "No," he admitted. "Rather because I am a man and I love you. and you jest with me and make mockery of my moment of triumph. I'm a good archer. My arrows fall strong and true. But as a woman, I have been the village joke for 2 decades. I came to Sheffield a girl with but one eye. I kept to myself, and until his death, my husband covered my infirmity as best he could. Since no one saw me clearly, they believed me to be old. Before my time, I was called old and will continue to be until I die. There is no place in your life for the likes of me. Why would you risk all for so little gain? In my judgment, the gain was immense, and the possible loss even greater. I was there with you, Ethel, so I will continue to be there for you if you will have it so. After years of revilement, Ethel hesitated, savoring his words. The fainting soldier was able to stand his judgment then. Serene explained the man was from Sheffield. Had his origins been revealed, it would have been up to you to kill him or be killed yourself. I could not allow that to happen. So you risked your life playing target to my arrows. Ethel shook her head in disbelief. What if I had wanted to kill him? I can't believe you ever wanted to kill anyone, he said, as he raised first one of her hands, then the other to his lips. And while Ethel knew she should challenge Drojan's assumption, she held her silence and allowed his kisses. She pressed him to her and realized the quickening of his body was in direct response to hers. She reassessed her opinion of the seer and decided that perhaps he wasn't such an old fool after all. And even if he was her old fool, and it was good and right. And then we come to the surrogate wife. And the surrogate wife has probably more back porch stories in it than any other book I've written. The spark for this started when I read one sentence in a book that said that up until 1810, there were no prisons for women in the Carolinas. If a woman was convicted of a crime, she was either put to death or put into indenture or servitude. And there was no other options at that time. And boy, that started me off running. And I started the book with, we find the defendant, Megan Ann Riley, guilty of murder. The jury foreman stared at the floor as he spoke and jumped noticeably when the judge slammed his gavel down on the top of the big oak desk. There was no other sound in the schoolhouse that served as a courtroom except for the nervous buzzing of the flies and the tiny gasp of the young woman who stood before the judge. Judge Harvey Osborne rubbed his hand over his face. He hated the whole situation. It was bad enough sentencing a man to death, but hanging a young woman was definitely against everything he believed. Still, there was little choice. He took his watch from his pocket and opened the case, as though looking at the time. However, it was not the hour Harvey Osborne was seeking, but reassurance. Silently, he read the inscription, "Let justice be done, though the heavens fall." As always, the words gave him courage to do what must be done. Still, Judge Osborne cleared his throat twice before speaking. "I have no choice but to sentence you, Megan Ann Riley, to death by hanging," and he got no further, for Megan Ann Riley fell to the floor in a dead faint and heard no more. In the rush that followed, Megan was lifted to a chair and held there while one of the village women waved a burnt feather under her nose. As the fervor quieted, the jury foreman raised his hand, waving it tentatively until he got the attention of the judge. Your Honor," he stammered, "the jury would like to suggest mercy for the defendant. We don't feel that Miss Riley killed Lily Daniels on purpose. She had no motive to do something like that. Most like it was an accident of sorts." Immediately, the prosecutor was on his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This woman has committed murder. In an unprovoked fit of rage, Miss Riley struck Lily Daniels and shoved her down the stairs, leaving a bereaved husband and a motherless child. She refused to admit her guilt, although it's been proved beyond all reasonable doubt, and the murderess shows no signs of remorse. She must be punished." The man warmed to his theme. Think of the poor widower who must cook and clean and milk and plow while he tries to raise his child alone without the help and succor of his beloved wife. He raised his hand, index finger pointing upward. In the name of Josh Daniels and his daughter, I demand retribution. The attorney looked over the room as though expecting applause. There was a buzz of voices, and again the judge brought down his gavel as Megan's lawyer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, my client cannot admit something of which she is not guilty. No one, including Megan herself, saw Mrs. Daniels fall to her death. You cannot sentence a woman to hang for something even the jury doubts she has done intentionally. I have no doubt she did it. The voice of Ruth Summers rang through the schoolroom. I saw her standing over poor Lily's body. I know what I saw. The crack of the gavel echoed above the sound of voices. Be quiet, all of you. Let me think on this a few minutes. Judge Osborne leaned back in his chair and scowled at the crowded room. The girl didn't deserve to die. It seemed as if her only crime had been one of panic. In all probability, the ladies came in unexpectedly and caught the girl pilfering. In her haste to get away, Megan Riley had likely knocked the fragile Lily flying as she tried to push past her and escape down the stairs. If Megan Riley had lived in Bainbridge for any length of time, it would have been an entirely different matter. But the girl had been there but a few weeks, with little to recommend her other than good manners, a cheery disposition, a decent education, and her willingness to work. He sighed. Judge Osborne was not an exceedingly clever man, but he prided himself on being fair. And he didn't feel that sentencing the girl to death was fair. Unfortunately, he was unable to come up with a satisfactory alternative. Justice was the name of the game, as it said in his watch case, and it was justice he was sworn to uphold. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. His eyes fell on the bent head of the newly widowed husband. It would be difficult for a man to carry out the duties of his farm and family without the help of a woman, and women were few and far between. The child had been sent east to stay with relatives during the trial, but the man would soon want her back. What Josh Daniels needed was a hired girl. Judge Osborne's head jerked up and the room fell silent as surely as if he'd struck his gavel. After taking the recommendation of the jury as well as both lawyer arguments under consideration, I have come to a decision. He paused dramatically and was pleased to see that the defendant had recovered enough to listen. Having been found guilty of murder and having the jury recommend mercy, in similar circumstances, a man would be sentenced to life in prison. However, we have no prison facilities for women in the Carolinas. I therefore sentence Megan Ann Riley to serve her sentence by working for Josh Daniels and his family in such manner as they see fit. She will work without remuneration other than bed and board and such clothing as is necessary. Why, that smacks of slavery, one of the women said in an outraged whisper. You can't send a young woman to live with a single man, Megan's lawyer burst out. It's immoral. I can and I will, the judge shouted. I cannot comprehend a man having sexual relations with a woman who killed his wife. But should Megan Riley manage to seduce Josh Daniels in an effort to lighten her lot, I will be forced to revert to the prescribed sentence of hanging, and Mr. Daniels will be held in contempt of court. With that, the gavel fell again, and the judge pushed his chair away from the teacher's desk and smiled in satisfaction. Yes, sir, he'd done it again, thought Judge Harvey Osborne. Josh Daniels had a helpmate who would work right alongside him for the rest of his life, and it wouldn't cost a cent, and Megan Riley wouldn't hang after all. He was still congratulating himself when he left the courtroom, oblivious to the shock, disbelief, and hostility on the faces of the man and woman most directly involved. I'm looking up to see. One of the stories that is incorporated in here is taken from a family story. We have a melodeon in our family that's said to be haunted. And I've run that story through this book. It's really a main, the organ in here is quite a main character. At this point, Ruth Summers, who was the one who claimed that Megan had killed Lily, has come to the Daniels household, and there's a rainstorm. So Ruth is going to, and her husband are going to spend the night. Megan hesitated before opening the door to the parlor. She had not entered the room after dark since the night she had run out so abruptly in an effort to escape the eerie sound of the organ, a sound that had ultimately sent her into Josh's arms to be held in his warm, wonderful, dangerous embrace. There was no sound tonight. Megan took the linens from the chest and made up the beds in record time. One note out of that organ and there was no power on earth that could force her to return. With a sigh of relief, she finished her task and closed the door behind her, returning to the main part of the house. The rain was coming down in earnest. Megan rushed into the room as Ruth appeared out the door. It was obvious that even the thought of going down the covered dog trot was distasteful. She held back, seemingly waiting for Megan to make some move. Finally, Ruth could hold back no longer. "Aren't you going out to the barn to sleep?" she asked. "Megan sleeps with Abby," Josh had had enough. He was exhausted. Sparring with a woman who was obviously trying to undermine every positive step he and Megan had been able to make in their living arrangements had sapped his strength. Nothing would make Ruth happier than to see Megan miserable. "Well, I never," Ruth protested. "You have now," Josh returned. Rafe took his wife's arm and steered her toward the door, but Ruth was not to be denied. She would have the last word. "Why didn't you make Megan sleep in the parlor?" she inquired. "Megan wouldn't sleep there. She was uncomfortable." Ruth snorted. "Well, I should think so. If Lily was anywhere on earth, it would be in that room. All of her belongings are there. It's a wonder poor Lily doesn't come back to haunt the person who wronged her." It pleased Ruth to see Megan noticeably pale, and her hands shook ever so slightly as she finished putting away the dishes. Without another word, Ruth marched out the door and followed her husband down the dog trot. It was some time after midnight when the storm reached its peak. Megan thought she heard moaning of the organ, but the sound was muted, and she assured herself it was only the wind in the trees. She pulled the blankets over her head and closed her ears to the sounds about her. Her mind closed to Ruth's suggestion that Lily Daniels' ghost roamed the parlor. She was on the edge of sleep when she heard Josh rise from his bed. She heard the doors slam and creak of the Summers' wagon as Rafe pulled it as near to the door as possible. "I thought Ruth would like sleeping in that room," Josh said, stifling a yawn. "She and Lily were always such good friends." Rafe's dark eyes shifted toward the parlor. "I cannot say what is in that room," Rafe told Josh, while Ruth wrapped herself in a piece of borrowed oilcloth. "The organ, it plays in the night. Ruth will not go back inside. And this time I agree." He wiped the rain from his face. "We will go home. I would rather be drowned in the darkness than hounded by the dead." And even though Josh graciously offered them his own bed, the Summerses couldn't leave the house fast enough. Rafe whipped the horse to a brisk trot despite the muddy roads. Josh went out and made sure the parlor door was securely shut. He listened but heard no sound other than the storm. Whatever it was that had chased his neighbors away was silent now. Actually, I'm going to give this away, and I apologize to anyone who hasn't read the book, but I'll tell you what it was with the melodeon. It was a gap in the window sill between the window and the window ledge, and when the wind blew from the west, it would blow in there into the bellows, and the organ would play notes. And it's the same thing in here, but it works a little bit different. I have one more thing. Because I do write romance, my very favorite scene in everything is at the end of this book. Abby is a little girl with big ears, and they put a bonnet on her. And she had to wear that bonnet day and night to try to keep those ears in. And Wolf Riley is Megan's half-brother, and he's a half-breed Indian. So both of these people really suffer from a social stigma in their own way. Now, Riley is going off with the Indians, and Abby is staying with Megan and her father. Abby sat on the door, and she's a little girl. Abby sat on the doorstep while Riley squatted before her. "But why do you have to go live with the Indians?" she asked. "Why can't you stay here?" I made a promise, and I have to keep it, Riley told her. I promised old Howling Dog that if he would stop burning the settlers' home and talk to Judge Osborne, I would go with him and help him build a new place for his people to live. When will you come back, the child asked, trying to understand and fight back her tears at the same time. I don't rightly know, but I will come back, I promise. He chucked her under the chin. Now give me that pretty smile to remember you by. I don't have a pretty smile, Abby said. My front teeth are too big, and the rest of me is too little, except for my ears. She all but choked on the admission. More than anything in this world, Abby didn't want Riley to think she was any uglier than she already was. Besides, she blundered on, trying desperately to change the subject, you said you won't forget me, but you will. You'll go away and you won't ever think of me at all, and when you come back, you'll just say something like, the last time I saw you, you were a little girl with big floppy ears, and that's all you'll remember. No, it's not, Riley assured her. I will come back, and I will remember you while I'm gone. Abby scoffed and turned away. She didn't believe him any more than he believed himself. It was all a bunch of kind-hearted lies people told so that saying goodbye would be easier, but it wasn't easier. Not for Abby. How could she bear it if she grew up and Riley came back and didn't know who she was? To add to her distress, tears popped out of her eyes and dribbled down her cheeks, and her nose felt leaky. Riley couldn't stand to see Abby cry. God knew she had had enough sorrow in her life, and he didn't want to be the cause of any more. Still, he knew she was young and, given time, would more than likely forget all about him. It occurred to him that he did not want Abby Daniels to forget him. He took off his beaded headband and handed it to the little girl. When you see this, think of me, he told her. There, it was done. He discharged any duty he had to make parting easier. He turned away and did not comprehend Abby's dilemma. She had nothing to give him. Riley was leaving. She might never see him again, and he had given her his beautiful headband. He would go away and fall in love with an Indian princess and never think of Abby again. She had to give him something of herself, something that she treasured, that was uniquely her own, something so unique that when he saw it, he would think of her alone. Riley started walking away, and Abby made her decision. Riley, wait. She tried to swallow the lump in her voice. Wait, Riley, I have something for you, too. She twisted her finger into one of the lovely curls Megan had fixed to cover her ears. With a little grunt of pain, she tore it from her scalp. She placed the curl in Riley's hand and then turned and ran away. Riley stood staring at the russet hair that curled lovingly on the palm of his hand. He thought of going after the little girl, but there was nothing more to say. Abby had said it all. As Riley walked toward his horse, he could hear Megan singing as she washed the clothes and Josh whistling to the stock as he drove the animals up from the creek. Riley felt the love that surrounded them. He would take part of that love away with him thanks to Abby. But more than that, he knew that with her gift, Abby had ensured the success of her request. For as sure as the world was round and day followed night, Abby Daniels was one person Wolf Riley wouldn't forget. And that's my last part of the reading, but that's one of my very favorite scenes.